In January of 1863, 13 men and boys were marched down a wagon track through the bottomlands of the Shelton Laurel River and shot. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, subsistence men, people who had lived in that valley their whole lives. The youngest was 13 years old. He watched his father and his brother die before they turned the rifles on him. According to the accounts that survived, he begged to be spared for his mother's sake. The soldiers did not spare him. The bodies were left in shallow graves, barely covered, exposed to the elements and to free-ranging hogs. A woman the valley knew as Granny Judy, a Shelton aunt to some of the dead, loaded what remained onto an ox sled and carried them 2 miles up the mountain to bury them properly. It was January, the ground was frozen, and the bodies had already been found by hogs. The men who ordered the executions were from the same county. Some of them had been neighbors. Nobody was ever convicted. The hollow where it happened still carries the name. Shelton Laurel was a tight mountain community in Madison County, North Carolina, a place the rest of the state barely knew existed. The people there were not plantation owners. They were small farmers, subsistence families, people whose people had been in those mountains since before the Revolution. They had fought for this country in the Revolutionary War. They had no slaves, no plantations, no economic stake in secession, and when the war came, they did not go Confederate the way the eastern counties did. Union sentiment ran hard through the hollows, and it ran especially hard through the Shelton family and their neighbors. By the winter of 1862, the war had been grinding for nearly 2 years, and in the mountains that meant something specific. Confederate conscription, taking men who did not want to go, promised government rations failing to arrive, and salt, the one thing a mountain family needed to preserve food through winter, being withheld from families suspected of Unionist sympathy. The men of Shelton Laurel were hungry, cold, and angry. In early January of 1863, a group of them rode into Marshall, the county seat, and decided to take what they had been denied. The raid on Marshall was not a military operation. It was desperate men breaking into a salt warehouse and taking 50 bushels. Along the way, some of them entered the home of Colonel Lawrence Allen, commander of the 64th North Carolina Infantry, who was away from home. His wife was there. His children were there, sick in their beds with scarlet fever. The raiders tore through the house, ripping blankets from the beds of the sick children, smashing trunks, terrorizing the family. Later, accounts say, the children died not long after. Whether the raid hastened their deaths, the records do not clearly say. What the records do say is that Colonel Allen and his cousin, Lieutenant Colonel James Keith, went to their commanding officer, Brigadier General Henry Heth, and asked permission to lead a punitive expedition into Shelton Laurel. Heth authorized it. He told them to take no prisoners if they met the raiders in an engagement. Keith used that order as a license for something else entirely. He marched his men into the hollow and rounded up every man and boy they could find, the majority of whom had nothing to do with the Marshall raid and had never set foot in the county seat. The women would not give up where the men were hiding. Keith's soldiers tied some of them to trees and whipped them. An infant was laid in the snow to force the mother to talk. Elderly women were dragged from their homes and interrogated in the cold. 15 men and boys were eventually taken prisoner. It was later determined that only 5 of the 15 had any connection to the Marshall raid at all. 2 managed to escape during the march out of the valley. That left 13, boys as young as 13 and 14, men up to their 50s, being walked down a frozen wagon track on a bitter January morning toward a bend in the Shelton Laurel River. At that bend, the column stopped. They were told to kneel, 5 at a time, then 5 more, then the last 3. David Shelton, 13 years old, was among the last group. He had already watched his father and his brother shot dead in the snow in front of him. Witnesses recorded that he begged for his life, told the soldiers his mother needed him. The order was given anyway. All 13 were members of the extended Shelton family and their neighbors, most of them sharing a surname with the valley itself. Most of these stories don't get told twice. If this channel disappears from your feed, the algorithm won't bring it back. Subscribe so the next one finds you. The bodies were dumped in a ditch, a shallow scraping in frozen ground, barely enough to cover them. Word reached the valley. Granny Judy, remembered by locals as a Shelton aunt to some of the dead, a woman whose name the records give only incompletely, came down with her children and loaded the remains onto an ox sled. The ground was frozen. The bodies had been damaged by exposure and by hogs that had found the shallow graves before she did. She carried them 2 miles up the mountain to a hill behind her cabin and buried them together in a single grave. That hilltop is where they still lie. Governor Zebulon Vance was furious when he learned what had happened. Solicitor Augustus Merriman investigated and reported to Vance in February 1863 that 3 of the dead were boys described as 13, 14, and 15 years old. The report documented women being whipped and tortured. Vance demanded prosecution. Keith was eventually jailed in Asheville to await trial on multiple murder charges. In early 1869, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled that a post-war Amnesty Act protected Keith as a former Confederate officer. He could not be prosecuted for acts committed in his official military capacity. Keith escaped from the Buncombe County Jail on the night of February 21st before the ruling could formally free him. He crossed the state line into South Carolina and was never recaptured. What happened in Shelton Laurel was not a battle. It was not a skirmish or a military engagement or a casualty of war in any recognized sense. It was 13 people kneeling in the snow at the order of a man who had the legal cover of a uniform in a hollow most of the country did not know existed, in a county that had not wanted this war in the first place. The Confederate command investigated and found the executions unjustified. Governor Vance called them murder. None of it brought anyone to justice. The valley absorbed what happened the way mountain communities absorb things, quietly across generations, held in family memory long after the official record moved on and the newspapers turned to other things, and the men responsible went home and lived their lives. The names are on a granite marker now near the hill where Granny Judy buried them more than 160 years ago. James Shelton, David Shelton, James Shelton Jr., Azariah Shelton, William Shelton, Rod Shelton, Jasper Chandler, Ellison King, Helen Moore, young David Shelton, 13 years old, James Metcalf, Wade Moore, Joe Woods. Madison County still remembers. The rest of the country, by and large, does not. Keith lived out his years in West Virginia and the hollow where 13 men and boys were shot dead on a January morning, has been absorbing weather and seasons for more than 160 years, and the Shelton Laurel River still runs cold through the bottomlands, where the column stopped and the order was given, and the hill where Granny Judy brought them is still there, marked only by a granite stone with 13 names cut into it, and the families who carry those names are still in the mountains, and they still know what happened there and why, and who was responsible, and that the man responsible walked free, and that the official record closed and the country moved on as countries do, leaving the valley to hold what the valley has always held in the way that hollows hold things quietly and for a very long time. That's another voice from the hollow. If this one stayed with you, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, The Stories America Left Behind.